Ooh. Yeah. Okay, so we're a year later, and there has been some genetic engineering that has occurred, right? This has happened. There has been genetic engineering that has occurred, or at least there's been some sort of splicing of biometrics, right? And, the whole gender confirmation may not be as relevant at the moment as the other confirmation, right? So I'm going to try to multitask here. I'm going to try to sign in on one hand and also address matters as I understand they've gone down. So yesterday I provided a video, actually two, that were very important. One of which acknowledged in memorandum of understanding that I actually understand it was identified as Russia, but was not exclusively Russia, that the United States had, specifically around disposal of CBRN, right? That there were these, for instance, biological weapons stockpiles that had been in the former Soviet Union and countries throughout the former Soviet Union, or what later became countries, and there was an agreement to destroy those biological weapons stockpiles. But there was also agreements around decommissioning of nuclear warheads, as well as matters related to chemical weapons. And what happened was during the 2010s time period, that memorandum of understanding expired. And when it expired, Russia specifically did not agree to re up. And so the United States chastised Russia for not re upping it. And one of the things it said specifically, if you do not agree to renew this memorandum of understanding, then you are going to be dispossessed of the capacity to have any access to due process through the American judicial system. This was part of what happened after that. So the implication was, or the understanding was, from this report I read from the Congressional Research Service, was that prior to that, while the Memorandum of Understanding was in effect, there would be recourse for Russia to go through the American legal system. But after that, they could not. Now, Russia had agreements with other countries, including European countries, that could go through the American legal system. But Russia itself, when it came to matters that had formerly been covered under what the terms were connected to that MOU, they would not have it. And so then this put other countries like Kazakhstan specifically and the Ukraine specifically in a different situation, because a lot of these terms have been set up by the former Soviet Union and the United States as part of the decommissioning. And so then the question became, well, Russia presumably is responsible for things connected to countries that were under the rubric of the Soviet Union, right? Because there were certain places where there were certain areas that were identified as high intensity areas. Now, you got to understand that at the time this was happening, when Congress was releasing this report, one of the things it said very specifically was that a problem they already knew existed was that Russia had a number of scientists and engineers that had been a part of its CBRN programs, and that with the collapse of the Soviet Union, they were concerned that these people were going to be recruited or were going to be more susceptible to recruitment for cooperation with terrorists or those that would have been deemed to be national security threats to the United States, as well as international threats, because of a lack of opportunity based upon their skill sets within Russia and the former Soviet Union. Now, this, to me, implies the United States knew that by compelling a recharacterization of whatever Russia considered to be a biological weapons program and whatever the United States decided or determined was a biological weapons program, as opposed to virology, immunobiology, right? All of these other things, then all of a sudden there was going to be a higher susceptibility of people that previously had very significant or advanced skill sets to recruitment into illegal activities. So what was the United States going to do about that, right? Well, that wasn't mentioned in the document specifically. But what was mentioned is that the legal remonstration that had previously been available to Russia and those countries had been taken away. You're not going to sign on our MOU. We're not going to let you sue us in court. We're not going to let you go through the court system. Okay. All right. All right. So that happened. But, if you read the rest of the report, it wasn't just about Russia. It was also about China. And at some point, something very significant happened to America's consideration of its priorities as characterization and its assessment of CBRN when Russia refused to re-up that MOU. Now, I'm going to tell you, when I read that, I'm reading through that, I'm like, oh my God, this is horrible. This is what they, first of all, what do they characterize as a biological weapon versus what did the former Soviet Union characterize as a biological weapon? I've contended and still contend that the United States has a different understanding of what's accepted as healthcare than other countries do. And that part of what we've been dealing with for the last 20 years is the United States has taken a dominant role in trying to define what is CBRN, or if they don't even use CBRN, right? That's a particular terminology, a chemical weapon, a biological weapon, as opposed to all of these different things, biomed, bioengineering, biotech, right? But then again, this is supposed to be specialized or exclusivized kind of information. What do we get? Healthcare, health insurance, vaccines, immunizations, right? And this is a different consideration, because what is a vaccine except a reconstituted biopathogen of some sort, a reconstituted vaccine? I mean, a virus, right? And, this potential for dualism or potential for dual use or multiple uses is not something that's really acknowledged. But, the other thing that's been happening is there was also a desperation in terms of identifying emergency measures related to preventative practices that came with early detection of potential misabuse of things that could be potentially weaponized, like chemicals that you may use in an industrial setting or even in a basic setting that could be disabused for combinations to create a chemical weapon. You're supposed to be able to identify these things, and part of the way you identify them is by making sure to adhere to processes that are outlined to you, including in manners for which you have to receive certification, to ensure you handle them safely so you are conscious that this could be misused. And if it is misused, you take notice, and when you take notice, that's called readiness. And when you have that kind of alertness as part of your readiness, if you need to respond, you can respond without escalating it past a point where it can be de-escalated as necessary, or a inability to respond in a non-emotional manner so that you can provide a potential non-violent alternative, right? Or a non-punitive alternative, or some of the other tactics that, if you go into behavioral sciences, unfortunately also can be abused, like redirection, right? And so now we're at this situation where once that happened, there was a very different way. The tone was different. The approach was different. When Russia dropped out of that particular commitment, the United States totally changed its mentality and its praxis when it came specifically to biological weapons. And it started this process of punitizing and penalizing and escalating what had already been implemented as punitive measures. I contend that one of the major things the United States refused to deal with is that whatever the terms were that were expected of Russia in regards to adherence to that MOU were intolerable. It was horrible. You can just read the congressional report and know, in all of their nice little legitimate Congress speak, that what they were trying to say was completely insulting, and it was intolerable, and we are not exercising the option to renew. Why do I bring this up? Well, because yesterday I was looking through my videos from yesterday. Yesterday would have been 1 year after what would have been a report that was due in conjunction with an executive commission by Donald Trump concerning immunizations and vaccines. Now, I had several videos. I had been doing research through 2019. There was all this weird stuff going on with vaccines and immunizations. It didn't really make sense, especially in connection with the fact that I was trying to get the courts and a variety of reporting agencies to take seriously my experiences in going through the Health and Human Services, right? So that's one thing. But the other thing that kept coming up is there was this consistent almost bifurcation. It was like there was a very strong faction within Congress that never acknowledged Donald Trump as president and was still operating under the command authority of Barack Obama, as if they believed at some point they would either successfully be able to resume democratic control outside of an electoral process, or they had every intention of bankrupting Donald Trump specifically to cover for problems and crimes that had been committed under previous administrations that were dominated by the Democrats. And so they needed to find a way to do everything they could to undermine whatever Donald Trump could do. Now, say what you want. Again, say what you want about him. I think he should never have been elected. Personally, I don't even think he should have been allowed to run. But if he does get elected, there has to either be a definitive, literal resolution of whatever the alleged crimes are he committed. It goes through a process of prosecuting him. Or you have to understand that he's the president and you have to deal with things. Let me ask you a question. Who thought that they could spend the entire 4 years of the Trump administration doing what they did with the impeachment process and not deal with JASTA? Hello? Were we just not supposed to know what that meant? And especially what that meant after the time that MOU expired and Russia didn't re-up, and right before the 25-year maturity on those bonds the United States had with Gazprom. We just weren't supposed to ever find out? Was that like state secret information that only you and your illegal broker know? Those are very, very, very globally important international security matters. Why were we not supposed to know? Okay, let me ask you a question. Why were we not supposed to know what the actual policy and rules were for practitioners of medicine when it came to alleging they were giving us medical treatment, including medical treatment that included experimental medications? I'm sorry. Those medications you tried to give me in 2017 were part of clinical trials. You were asked directly, is there any clinical trial involved? Your answer was, I don't know. You're not allowed to have that job if you don't know. Your job is to know. You can't say I don't know. That's not confidential information. That's not classified information. Your literal job is to know. You weren't doing your job. What were you doing? Do you think it's reasonable? Under those circumstances, a year goes on, you have to renew the contract in order to keep financing it or to evaluate terms, including terms people say they have to deal with regarding compensation, benefits, insurance. And your entire last year, you've been telling people you don't know what your job is. I'm not going to be able to renew the contract. Obviously, there was some problems here, and it's not just about training because a considerable amount of the costs were involved with training. You wanted credit for the training. You wanted the certification for the training. But you've been telling people, I don't know. It's literally your job to answer that question because it's literally your job to ask it yourself. Right? And so this MOU doesn't get renewed. This MOU doesn't get renewed. All these things are happening. We got to deal with, there's all of this stuff about Russia sanctioned for this, oligarchs, all of these things. Okay, let's talk about 1993, specifically the 1993 Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act. Let's talk specifically about the areas regarding the relationship between the Department of Treasury and the issuances of short-term Treasury notes for 91 days concerning defaulted student loan debt for terms up to 25 years. Let's talk about 105 and 106, i.e. 1995 and 1996. 1995 was 105, 1996 was 106. We just passed those terms, right? Somewhere in somebody's accounting process, it was already predetermined that there were going to be student loans that were defaulted so that they could be leveraged through 91-day T-notes with Treasury in order to do federal debt service. That is a capital fucking outlay. Now, if you tell somebody when they go to sign up for college that they're getting a federal loan and that they're going to be expected to participate in 25 years of an outlay process with the federal government, you're going to have a different relationship. You better hope that in year 21 or 22, they don't find out exactly where that is, what it means, and say, wait a second. Everything about that original contract associated with me getting that alleged student loan was actually part of a federal outlay process. And you were not honest about what the terms were to begin, so you had no way to be honest about telling me about what the terms were regarding default, which may explain why you never said anything to me about it for the entire 25 years you tried to obligate me to federal debt service. obligation in performance of a process connected to capital outlays is different than a situation of illegal debt, including illegal debt engaged through an intent to deceive and defraud when they do not disclose ahead of time their intent behind engaging you in that contract that they have not provided in actual written form or even verbal form at the time they engage it. Do you understand that? It's very simple. Whose job was that? Whose job was it to set up those contracts in relationship to federal student loan debt? Specifically for people that were obligated under the terms of the 1993 Omnibus and Budget Reconciliation Act. See, I got two. I got one that would have been for 95 and one that would have been for 96 because there was a problem in the meantime, right? So I had to apply a second time. I've been working both the whole time. And the problem is somebody set me up on obligations for the first one connected to deals with the Russian CBRN program, right? And the decommissioning and the decom, right? Nobody told me that. I had to figure that out on myself. But the problem is I did something. And they didn't like what I did. And they didn't want me to spend 25 years with that kind of valuation. They didn't want to attribute or credit to me that kind of performance for 25 years in connection with that kind of appropriation. No, they wanted me at another level. And when they did that, I contend they did some double leverage. And then they gave me an obligation with China. Well, what was my obligation with China? Right? This is what they don't want to say. So I've been dealing with obligations connected to deals that they had already appropriated for among other things, high-profile activities associated with the decommissioning of the Soviet Union, but I've also been dealing with appropriations connected to very high-profile things they were trying to do with China. Now, those guys, well, both of them, they're hacking America left and right. They're public enemy number one. They got spies all over the place. Nobody ever told anybody in this country what our obligations were. You know what happens if you actually fulfill them? You got a 20-year outlay on cybersecurity connected to the American and Chinese collaboration around military satellite technology. You meet the 20-year benchmark. What happens? I mean, the closest thing I could do was I had to go out of country. I had to go to the Caribbean for that one, right? Why? Because I showed up to the fucking senator's fucking office and he trafficked me for a goddamn muni bond! Yeah. I mean, was it intelligence? If it was intelligence, asshole, why didn't you give me a chain of command? And that's why none of this is intelligence. Okay. So now we've come to the end of this year. Last year, Congress tried to hustle a big scam connected to student loan debt, but they didn't tell anybody the truth about what was going on, did they? No, they didn't. And not only that, they set up a process to consolidate all that student loan debt and send it off to someone. Who's working this account right now? It is 11:53 on June 2nd, 2021. Who am I talking to through this camera right fucking now? Because you know what happened and you're pissed. I know you're pissed. You thought you were going to get something out of me, but I did not re-up the MOU last year, did I? That's what you just heard. See, if you did this thing where you got a bunch of jackass Americans that thought that they were smarter than everybody else, so they were going to spend 25 years showing you how much smarter they were than you, and you had to go through it, and you had to go through it, and you had to bide your time, and you said what? What did you say in the 70s? What did the Soviet Union tell the United States? Equal treatment. You fool me once, shame on me, right? Equal treatment. I didn't re-up the MOU. What are you going to do? And I fulfilled all of my obligations, both to the former Soviet Union and to the People's Republic of China. The ones I had to do with China didn't have extended a time frame, did they? I fulfilled them. I got sabotaged. Now, I fulfilled my terms with the Soviet Union. It turned out to be a little bit longer. It's all fucking come to me. You know how much could have been fucking prevented if they hadn't been fucking around with whatever the fuck else they thought that they would broker? See, this is the problem. I have a feeling, and I understand, that what the United States wants to downgrade, and they want to make all incendiary, as some completely fucking racist eugenicist paradigm concerning healthcare and vaccinations and immunizations is probably something somebody else would consider to be a part of a national biodefense strategy, including in the use of biological weapons as an offensive measure. Right? But you're not allowed to say it that way. And nobody in the United States will even admit that's what we've been doing. But now we're in this strange situation here where they've spent 5 years in the United States pretending like everybody else except actual Americans are in charge of America because somehow this is what America is now. And nobody tells the truth. And nobody keeps track of the record. And nobody actually responds to what their actual job is supposed to be while they're doing something else they expect to get paid for and addressed as some sort of workers' rights issue. And all of that was engineered by the Federal Reserve anyway. But we're not supposed to be on that level, right? Who deals with the Federal Reserve? You got to deal with actual practical things you need. The Federal Reserve, it's just some obscure policy. Yeah, some PhD guys or some big banker guys deal with stuff like that. That's not a practical matter. The point of the matter is, I never owed to begin with. There were obligations. Had they been explained to me reasonably, I could have met them. Somebody decided to play this protracted psyop and then tried to tell us that did not conform to a particular specification that we had an illness. And there's no cure for it. Right? So what are you going to do now? Because it's that literal. Right? How many people are dead? How many people are dead? How many people were killed by biological weapons? Who's going to pay for it? Who's going to pay for all the people that died because of biological weapons? Are they going to be restituted at $40,000 a person? See, here in Texas, the deal was $400,000. The life insurance policy on a deferred enlistment program participant was $400,000. Does that mean that every single person who died in the United States of COVID-19 is going to be assessed a value of $400,000? Why? Were they signed up to become a future veteran as part of a transition of military operations under the rubric of the Health and Human Services, the CDC? And meanwhile, what happened to the actual military and an actual chain of command and an actual structure for accountability and anything that would have come with addressing the failures of the civilian leadership to prevent against the exploitation of the military and the special role of the military when it came to international matters that had a direct impact on the processes going on domestically? Who's going to pay for that? See, I don't owe for that. See, last year, in just the right time, I was able to recalibrate and find where I was supposed to be for over 10 years. Somebody has been taking my life and doing stuff with it that were appropriated under one line for the DOD, but working it through the Department of State to set up all of these acts of sabotage around the world, including in the form of acts of sex terrorism. But somebody really likes the advantages that come with getting away with sex terrorism. Somebody wants me to believe this is part of a global economy that has been meted out where people are engaging in the sex trade as a form of legitimate commerce and they have a right to be respected and treated as workers. Well, the thing is, you weren't using your own life as your work. You weren't using your own life as your work, and you didn't want to take responsibility for whose life you were using. This has been going on for over 10 years. And now we're at a point where last year, if you had not been trying to set up a sex trade with stuff you should never have had access to, then that stuff could have been used to actually provide a first response. And what just happened in India would not have happened. I'm just letting you know. Wait a second. You mean if people were actually practicing the law as opposed to doing illegal bid rigging and acts of securities fraud through the judicial branch, what happened to India last year would not have happened? Yes. Right? So even if you want to say, well, you know, we needed to reprogram you from the DOD anyway, where would you have reprogrammed me? How was it that you were allowed to reprogram me Because you have the power to do that, right? How were you allowed to reprogram me out of having any access to rights to due process? See, because this is what it says. You had me working that MOU with Russia, didn't you? And that's why I was allowed to have a lawyer in 2010. But once that MOU did not get re-upped, you did not have the financing to force me to stay on drugs. And what happened after that? Well, then I became a Ukrainian asset and I got sanctioned. And I haven't been allowed to have a conversation, a legitimate conversation with an attorney ever since. Is this because you have assessed in some way that I have enough genetic information, or that I'm genetically enough identified as being an origin through somewhere within the former Soviet Union, that based on somebody's standard of family lineage, I would be available to be considered as a national asset for forced expropriation as a way to extort them into agreeing to cooperate with a global biological terrorist attack? No, I'm sorry, that's too much. Okay, so what is the justification? Why am I saying this? Because we're not going to have 25 years of the federal government lying to people about what it meant to try to go to college. 25 years of people being lied to about what it meant to go to college. And everybody's college future is black, right? That's what you did with your futures for Black America. It isn't about actually getting civil rights for African Americans. You wanted to make everybody black so that you could justify parsing us out like human chattel and giving us back what you thought we were entitled to have or allowed to have based on your assessment of our characterization. This is not even about a centrally planned economy. It's so primitive. I'm letting you know, I'm not renewing any goddamn MOU, and I didn't last year. That absolutely was. It was a confirmation of a refusal to confirm that contract. It was originally engaged under completely fraudulent pretenses. I was made to work it for 25 years without any access to due process, and what they dispossessed me of and stole from me was used in acts of terrorism. Not only that, but they had time frames connected to coverage regarding responses to and protections regarding terrorism, and that defaulted in April of this year. It defaulted in April of this year, and the big problem is that I had already, before the September 11th, the terrorist attacks, provided what could have been used as coverage. But they lied about it and let somebody who was not supposed to be elected president use it for their election campaign. They subjected me and entire other communities of people to political reprisal merely because we would have voted for a different candidate and we would have advocated for different issues if we had been elected to public office. And in the course of that, they have engaged and tried to carry out a eugenicist campaign that is so virulent that if you even acknowledge the word eugenics, you're going to have to deal with it. You don't want to hear that word. Well, hear this word. You engaged a eugenicist campaign. The history of eugenics in this country was unconscionable. Among the things you did is you took people that did not exhibit behavioral characteristics that you thought accurately represented what you identified as their race. You institutionalized them, you forced sterilized them, in some cases you lobotomized them, you tortured them, you stole their genetic materials, and then you tried to make biological weapons with them. You have persisted to this day, and unfortunately, the refusal to hold you accountable has become unsustainable. It very well may justify all means necessary to disengage the rest of the world, including the people within the continental United States, from the crimes of those that thought they were entitled to use eugenics as a form of oppression. You're not allowed to. You're not entitled to. Even if you thought you could get away with it, you've overstepped your mandate. You can't cover it. It's done one way or another.